Welcome, listeners, to the Religious Studies Project. It's been a while since you've heard my voice, and I hope that you're going to hear a lot of it today. My name's Chris Cotter, and I'm joined from across the other side of the Atlantic Ocean by
Dave McConaughey. It's so nice to be with you again, Chris.
Yes,
in 2020, no less.
2020, yes. New year, new decade. Who knows what's going to happen?
I know. Fresh start, lots of plans ahead for the RSP.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were going to spend the festive break trying to enact a lot of our plans, and that maybe didn't happen, but there's still a lot of exciting developments. Before we talk on too much, though, this was a podcast I recorded, Dave, so perhaps you might want to just tell the listeners what's coming up.
Absolutely. Today, Chris is joined with Vivian Asimos and Tim Hutchings and Suzanne Owens, a wonderful trio for you to talk to, and all of them are speaking about media and the study of religion. So take it away.
Welcome, listeners, to a special roundtable episode of the Religious Studies Project. We had hoped that this would happen at the BASR 2019 conference at Leeds Trinity, but everyone was too busy, too tired, over-podcasted, and so we thought we would convene later on online, and we're talking about media and the study of religion. We've had a few podcasts touching on this topic before. You know, we've had one that Tim, who you'll be hearing from in a moment, was involved in about religion in the news. We had Temu Tyra talking about religion and the media. But today we're going to be taking a much broader approach, I think, to the notion of media and the study of religion. So mediation and the various media in which that can occur. So I'm just going to allow the speakers to introduce themselves and say a little bit about how media crops up in their work. So for those who don't know, I'm Chris Cotter. I'm one of the co-founders of the Religious Studies Project. And I'm going to let other people speak first before I scrabble around to try and think about how media comes up in my work. But Vivian, you're first on my list here. Who are you and what's media for you?
Quite a big question regarding my work. But so I'm Vivian Asimos. I recently got my PhD at Durham University, which is currently where I'm still acting as teaching assistant on several kinds of courses. And I study virtual storytelling, primarily looking at the internet and video games. So lots of media that I'm looking at in different types, sometimes even looking at it historically, how things used to be, historically speaking for the internet, obviously not quite as breadth of history as maybe some other people are used to looking at, but seeing how things change over time. And also how this impacts our ideas of supernatural or communication of religion, those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Excellent. So well qualified to be at this table, this virtual table, and this podcast that's being mediated to the listeners' ears, and we're recording it via the internet. So it's already a case study in that. And then we've got Suzanne Owen.
Yes, I'm reader in religious studies at Leeds Trinity University. And just say that the four of us are in 4 different locations. So that's possible because of media, digital media. And in my research, I've not focused on media per se, but it has had come in different forms. So in my work with the research in Newfoundland, I've been looking at not digital media, but I guess you might call it hard media. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. Artwork and museum exhibitions and how representations of particular Indigenous groups are portrayed, and the discourse, and that the text that surrounds it and what they're emphasizing or what they're hiding. But I guess more directly with digital media, with the project that Temu Tyra and I did with the Druid Network on the registration as a charity for the advancement of religion, there was quite a lot of media discourse that we included in our study to show the different responses to that registration.
Excellent. And then I guess sort of the driving force behind this podcast is Tim Hutchings.
Hi, I am the assistant professor in religious ethics at the University of Nottingham, but I'm mostly a sociologist of digital religion. For 10 or 15 years, I've been studying, you could say, the opposite of the kind of approach that Vivian takes. So my research began by looking at what particularly Christian institutions were trying to do with digital media. So very formalized, institutionalized, traditional versions of religion, trying to produce forms of online community or online ritual that they could recognize as proper Christian church. And from there, I've been fascinated by that ongoing struggle in some ways, maybe, but of institutions that are quite slow and ponderous sometimes to get to grips with a fast-moving medium, the whole set of media. One of the things I've particularly enjoyed studying around that field is seeing the number of projects that don't quite work out. The study of religion and media is often the study of disasters and failures and things that are quietly forgotten as quickly as possible. But I've looked at projects like attempts to encourage people to read the Bible through digital media, attempts to create online communities, attempts to produce religious mobile apps, and some kind of emerging conversations online around death and grief. And at the moment, I'm looking at a video game, but it's a video game produced again by a Christian organization to try and teach children about the Bible, more or less. So those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in.
Excellent. And Tim, you've also got a journal as well that we should probably mention.
Yes, thank you. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Religion, Media and Digital Culture, which is published by Brill in collaboration with the International Society for Media, Religion and Culture.
Excellent. And we'll try and link to that from the podcast page. And as I said, I would let other people speak before trying to come up with something on this end. So my research, I work broadly looking at non-religion. So basically anything that could be conceptualized as a relational other to religion. Primarily my work has been interview-based and ethnographic, but sort of an interesting way in which I guess you could say mediation comes in is I've done a good bit of work looking at the built environment and how, particularly my field site from a PhD was Edinburgh's South Side, but how the South Side was felt and how people's non-religious lives were sort of impacted upon by the sort of Christian hegemony of the spaces and all the sort of conversions and things like that. So a little bit on sort of how space can be seen as mediating discourse, but then also, of course, especially when you're looking at atheism, etc., there's so much stuff online and you've got to pay attention to. So a bit of that. And then, of course, there's also the production of media, which we'll probably be talking about as well. There's the Religious Studies Project here, which you're listening to, I suppose. And Vivian, you've also got a podcast.
I do. I have the Religion and Popular Culture podcast where I interview different people in the field of the study of religion and popular culture. Unfortunately, Tim and I keep missing dates on being recorded for it, but I've gotten quite a few people that approach things from a variety of different perspectives. And I use popular culture quite broadly, I think, to encapsulate all sorts of different types of medias and media types, and even just the things that we take for granted as being around us every day. So yeah, check it out if you like podcasts and religion.
Well, presumably people who are listening have at least some sort of passion in podcasts and religion. Okay, I thought we could kick off a little bit because, as I say, we meant to try and record at the BASR 2019 conference, which Suzanne organized, and one of the words in the title was media. So maybe Suzanne, you could just tell us a little bit about what the conference theme was and anything that came out of it for you. And then as we're all there, we might have some stuff to offer.
Yes, when I was asked to organize the conference, I immediately thought of my colleagues in media, film, and culture to help co-organize it, because I'm the only person in religious studies at my institution. And that turned out to be really great collaboration with, particularly with Stefano Odorico, who is a documentary filmmaker, and he's really interested in developing new digital skills among students and also in research with interactive documentary filmmaking in particular. And one of the things when we were discussing various titles, we didn't want to make religion too prominent, because he thought that it would be off-putting to people from his side. And so we came up with Visualizing Cultures, Media, Technology, and Religion. In the end, it really was a BASR conference, as most of the participants were BASR people. But I think it was also trying to emphasize that, religion is not a rarefied thing, I suppose, just part of a bundle in this title, and also to try to emphasize the kind of collaborative projects that might be happening, or interdisciplinary projects, which I guess religious studies is by nature for the most part, but in the way that we might be using different disciplinary skills in the study of religion in order to do our research. And so Visualizing Cultures seemed to capture everything that we wanted to bring to the conference, and to allow, people to come that might not ordinarily come to a BASR. And we did get a few participants in that group that they came because of the theme. And most of them did do a kind of study of religion of some type, but not all of them. And so that was really good to see.
Excellent. Yes, I saw papers to do with, there was James Capello talking about archival work. We had Vivian and Jonathan and a few others, presenting about virtual worlds. And I remember Michael Dudek, it was quite an innovative paper. It was developing a sort of virtual constructed religion. I think he called it the Temple of Artifice. And so his presentation was very interactive and very on the nose, and I guess sort of pushed us to think a little bit about, what we're doing in the study of religion. Like, can we be constructing things in that sort of way? It was quite excellent.
Yes, it is interesting that Michael Dudek's project, where he's deliberately creating a religion that's digitally available to participate in. In some ways, we are doing the same thing, but we think we're doing it. I guess we think we're doing it for real, I guess, and it's really good to see that actually what we're doing is just as constructed and fictionalized.
I mean, I would probably argue that what I'm doing isn't for real and yet is at the same time. So, I know, because what I tend to look at is constructed fictional narratives that people are engaging with. So these are ones that nobody's working at it from, say, the perspective of Michael of, we're trying to form this into something. Very seldom does that happen. And yet it tends to take off in that direction. And so very often it's that sense of real, but it's not simultaneously. Yeah. And I think it kind of reveals a lot of how we actually do see the world as not always being these strict dichotomies between fiction and reality, but that they can be blurred, and they often are, and that the internet and the way that the online storytelling really works ends up actually revealing that to us.
Yes, and what Dudek produced was actually real as well. And actually that word reality and real was used quite a lot in the conference by participants, I noticed.
Yes, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine.
Do you want to say some more about that, Vivian? You've got the airtime.
Yeah, sure. It's this sense, and you see it a lot even outside of the academic circle, of the real world versus the online world or the virtual world or the digital world. And essentially what that's doing is painting this virtual world as being completely not real, and therefore all communities formed, all relationships had, all experiences are therefore painted as not real, because it's being pit up against the physical world, which is the real world. So I pit for physical world rather than real to distinguish, because I don't want to take away from the experiences that are actually being had, that are very really felt by participants, by painting them as not real.
I mean, what is qualitatively different from the experience that someone is supposedly having, whether it's mediated through sound or in a particular building, or through radio waves, or through the telephone or the television, or online, or in a field, or whatever. These are all just different media that are being utilized. But yeah, that there is definitely a current bias towards the online world as being in some way not as authentic. Yeah, as I'm sure we would all agree, for many it can be more, quote, authentic than the physical world.
Yeah, it's interesting because this distinction in fantasy fiction is similar, where they have primary and secondary world, and primary world is meant to be the real world, but there is no real world in fiction, or any kind of representation, and also it's creating a false boundary, really. Yeah.
So I struggled with this a lot when I was doing my research about online churches, to try and work out what would be the other thing that I was distinguishing these from. And I started off thinking, well, it's online churches versus offline churches. But that doesn't make sense, because lots of those offline churches have websites or some sort of online presence, and maybe you communicate with the pastor of the church by email or something like this. They're not digital free spaces, but they are mediated differently in some way. And physical, to me, didn't quite work either, because we use physical technologies, of course, to connect with digital communications as well as anything else. So I ended up talking about the online and the local, trying to catch that sense of a thing that is defined by the place where it happens, rather than the media through which or the digital media through which we communicate it. But it's still not quite right.
Yes, the terminology.
The other point that I wanted to catch there is that one of the moves that is often made in the conversations I hear is to say, well, the online and the offline are no longer distinct at all, and we need to abandon this binary, which also doesn't quite work for the groups I'm looking at, because the value of the online space is partly that it is not the face-to-face. It is, so as Vivian was saying, I think it's real, but it's sort of not quite real at the same time, which gives you the freedom to be more playful. So the Center for Media, Religion and Culture in Colorado at the University of Boulder has been talking about digital as a third space, which is helpful, I think. They've been writing about this for years and years, trying to focus on the as-ifness of a place that is sometimes treated as if it is real and sometimes treated as if it is just a game, and used as a space to reflect on what happens elsewhere. Because one of the things that I found in the very kind of clearly bounded online spaces I was looking at, where people would say, well, this website is my church, or whatever it might be, they would use those to then reflect on everything that was happening elsewhere in the world. But that would include face-to-face and Facebook and the rest of internet culture and the email conversations that participants had with their parents. So everything that happened outside the boundary. So there was a really important distinction between what happens inside the boundary and outside the boundary, but it wasn't drawn in the same place as the online and offline distinction. And it wasn't quite in the same place as the real and virtual distinction. But it was important to people that this was different from a serious, real place. You could be a little playful.
If I'm correct in remembering, Vivian, it came up in your paper at the BASR how there's often this notion that I guess we can't trust what people say online, or but actually what can happen is that people's online expressions can in some ways be maybe sort of less filtered and more, quote, real than they might be in face-to-face social interactions. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah. And it obviously is going to depend on individuals. But what I found was that, at least when talking with, say, academics who have a bit of a bias against virtual worlds, to kind of paint something more broadly there, they tend to say that because things can be anonymized, therefore you can't trust anything. What I found during my fieldwork, as well as just from my own personal experience of living in various online spaces at various points in my life, is that there was still an identity that is tied to the username. And often users can feel more empowered to act in a way that they might not be able to. So, for example, if I'm on, say, even just an academic forum, and I'm using a username, I might feel more compelled to be more strict in my opinions, because I'm not going to feel like I'm going to be questioned for being a woman, like I might if I'm in a physical space where people can look at me and see that I'm a woman. So I might feel more willing to express myself when people can't tell how young I am, how female I am. And I see this play out even online as well. And I interestingly had strange responses when I was conducting fieldwork, where I had people reaching out to me to discuss their experience on these forums, but they would use throwaway accounts, which essentially means they would create a new account solely for the purpose of our communication and then immediately get rid of it. And this was because they didn't want what they said to be tied to their identity. So they were anonymizing themselves through what other people see as an anonymous username, because it's not an anonymous username. It's tied to their identity there. It's tied to experiences and lingo and neighborhoods that they crawl, and experiences and relationships are all tied to that name in the same way that, those same exact things are tied to, my Vivian Asimos name.
Yeah, excellent. So it's interesting that although we're trying to have this broad discussion around media and the study of religion, our focus is quite naturally being drawn to, I guess, online, digital, virtual, and so on. And I guess that might be because it's the latest medium of our times. I guess if we were having this discussion around the time of the printing press or the telephone or the television and stuff, our conversation might be differently inflected. So maybe, because Suzanne, you mentioned working with sort of, I guess, more, guess we could call it traditional forms of media. Do you have any thoughts on your work there?
Yeah. In some ways, it is the same kind of research, because I'd interviewed artists and about their artwork, and of course, some artists say they portray their art in a kind of non-conscious way, but I was still able to elicit some kind of discussion about the themes that they're interested in, and because they were all depicting an extinct indigenous group in their artwork, and I thought it was a way that they could show their relationship to that subject in a non-verbal way, which offered an interesting insight that was different from the way that written texts or museum exhibits represent that group. And I thought I got a really different kind of perspective. So I think different kinds of media can bring out different kinds of insights for sure in research. And it also reminds me a little bit like when I used to do theater, there was one time during, just for ourselves among the group that were doing the play, we did an experiment with masks where we were wearing different masks. It's just to remind me of what Vivian was saying with online identities and how the mask then becomes the focus of your interaction. And they're no longer the person behind the mask, but the mask could be sort of male, female, androgynous, animal, human, alien. And our relationship then just completely changed. And I think that's the beauty of different kinds of media, that you get really different kinds of responses and interactions.
Absolutely. Time is bizarrely moving on, as it tends to do. And I do want to get to the idea of how media can be utilized in the teaching of the study of religion. But I couldn't resist getting a comment in here about how I'll be interested in your thoughts on much of the work that I encounter that seems to be taking a media approach or looking at media in relation to religion. A lot of it tends to trip up on that sort of critical problem of there is something there that is being mediated, I guess, and a lot of this work is sort of the assumption is there is religion or there is, I guess, deity or whatever that is being mediated through things, rather than perhaps taking a more social constructivist approach. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, as we were saying before we started recording, that the idea is that sometimes researchers think there is religion out there, and that is being mediated through various, things like news or digital spaces. Whereas we should really look at stuff that's out there that gets mediated as something, maybe as religion and discourse. It's a discourse analysis kind of approach, where we can't assume that there is something that exists prior to the discourse about it. That religion is not a priori in that sense. Yeah.
And I guess, Tim, you've been talking about working with, churches in online spaces. Like, how did you, did you wrestle with that? I'm just allowing the group to, I suppose, define what it is, and then I'm looking for that being mediated online, or, how did you go about, your setting your boundaries?
Yeah. So around this question of reality, thinking back to my early research in online churches, outside of those online communities, one of the big conversations about them was whether this should be considered real church or not. Which, from a kind of sociological perspective, is not a very useful category for me, because, of course, there are a lot of different Christian traditions. They all define what is a real church differently. People from those traditions mix up together in online communities. So if you actually push the question, you'll quite quickly find that people may agree or disagree about whether what they're doing is real within the same group, and just politely don't mention it very often. So I tried to allow groups to define themselves, and just said, if you're calling what you do church, then I'm interested in finding out what it is. But while keeping in mind that ambivalence, I guess, who gets to decide whether this group calls itself church or not? In some cases, the person who set up the thing decided, let's call this the church of such and such. But actually, if you had conversations with people who had been participating there for 10 years, every day, multiple hours a day, they'd say, oh, well, of course, it's not really church. So it was an inherently undefined word. And when people did want to claim that word, they often didn't want to do it in ways that traditional Christian authorities would respect, shall we say. So they might want to say, okay, so traditionally my group has said that church has got to do these particular rituals and you've got to have this particular authority structure. I don't really care about that. What I care about is that I've made really important friendships here. It means a lot to me that this is a space where I have very important relationships and real emotional commitment, and so I call it church. And how dare you question whether this is church for me? Are you saying my friendships aren't real? Which is fascinating, because that is not that is I don't know if it's a new way of thinking about church, but it's a way of thinking about what is real that is different from the institutional tradition, perhaps. So in line with this question about what is there a previous, like a pre-mediated thing, there are conversations in the study of religion, media, and culture for many years now that I've found really helpful, trying to reconceive religion itself as a kind of mediation. So people like Jeremy Stollow and Birgit Meyer and others have argued that any study of religion and media that frames it as religion and media, so there are two separate things, is not catching the really interesting part of the study of not the really interesting part of the field, which is that religion itself is always mediated. Religion itself can be understood as a kind of media or a set of practices of mediation. Certain things that are permissible or forbidden or expected within a certain group that make connections between the human and the non-human. And I found that really helpful as a way of positioning what I'm interested in this very current study of digital religion, as part of the same kind of thing that all of my colleagues do in their studies of religion across centuries.
I considered trying to get mediating or mediatizing or something into the title of the podcast. I might make it mediation and the study of religion or something, just to emphasize that. Vivian, I know that you sometimes use the lens of myth in what you're studying as well. So again, how do you decide when it's religion that's being mediated and things like that?
I tend to not be too bothered about the word religion, which might be a bit strange to say as somebody who is a religion scholar and in a religion department. But that's how I see myself, because I don't think anyone really knows precisely what religion is. And therefore, how do you try to go about finding it if you don't know precisely what it is? So myth to me is a much more useful word than religion, although probably has just as many problematic definitions throughout its history as religion does. But I see myth as being essentially defined by the individual or the community, which means that it's not up to me, kind of like what Tim was saying of leaving the community to kind of define for themselves what matters and what doesn't matter, and what words matter and what words don't matter, and seeing how they connect to a narrative in a very meaningful way. So I tend to focus more on myth than on religion because of that. So I am a mythographer as well as a religion scholar. And it has gotten me into trouble in the past. And that's interesting in itself, to think about how we as scholars are mediating our own understanding of religion onto our own discipline. Where, so in my first year review board, I was asked why I was in a religion department if I'm not looking at religion, which I felt like I both was and wasn't. So it's interesting to be told time and time again that you're not studying religion when you feel like you are, but in a slightly different way, because essentially we're ascribing our own understandings onto our own disciplines and mediating that through our own, podcasts.
I think the problem is that everyone does know what religion is, or says that they, or thinks that they do, and so that's why there's so many ideas about religion, because everybody is so sure that they know what it is. Whereas I think that there isn't something there anyway. Like, I guess with any kind of thing, even with any kind of abstract subject, it is obviously mediated and created and born out of relationship and dialogue and discussion. and what people portray or what they define as. So comparing definitions is one of the first things I do with students in first year, is to show that there are many definitions of religion. And there are some essential differences between these definitions. And what does that say, about it? What are they emphasizing, or what are they selecting and excluding to create this thing called religion that they've defined? It was an ongoing sort of disagreement I had with my own supervisor about whether or not you should define what you're researching. And of course, I'm seeing it more as those that I'm researching are defining terms.
Yeah, so in response to what Suzanne was saying a moment ago about the discursive approach or discourse analysis approach to religion, an advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, of that kind of approach, I think, is that actually the word religion is very rarely used by the people I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Unless they're trying to step back from their kind of engaged experience and be more analytical about it and say, well, maybe this is a kind of religion. In Christian context, it's quite common for people to say, well, this is not religion. Religion is the bad thing that we have done, that we are better than religion because we are spiritual, or something like that. Religion is a word that is mostly imposed by academics onto the field in things like Vivian's department meetings. So religion is a real thing because we study this. But then in reflecting on what Vivian was saying, I had similar experiences myself. And that's maybe a useful pointer for people listening to this podcast, particularly if you're just starting out in an academic career. If you're studying something unusual and exciting and to do with pop culture, at some point somebody will say, yes, but is it religion? And even if that is a made-up word that doesn't really exist, religion departments do exist. Those are definitely real. And it's a question that it's worth, it will come up at some point. It's worth having an answer to it. So when people asked me that question, I was left slightly taken aback. And so it's worth anticipating it before it arrives.
Absolutely. So that brings us quite nicely, I suppose, to our final question. And we're a little over time, but we're going to run with it because we've been talking there about students and about supervisors and about how the subject of the study of religion, whether that's religious studies or sociology or religion or anthropology, etc., how we mediate the very topic. But I wonder, Tim was mentioning before we started how institutions are now increasingly wanting us to incorporate media in various forms into, and I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts about that, or any useful stories, or any useful failures and things like that.
This is actually something that more recently I've been engaging with, but not using things like the internet or podcasts so much as using the kind of more, I guess, traditional media, primarily of pictures, with my students. Normally, as a teaching assistant, you tend to not get quite as much creativity allowed to you when it comes to teaching. But I've been able to play with it a bit this year because there's a new first-year module that we've kind of shifted study of religion to being a worldviews approach by Douglas Davies. And the whole conversation on how he structured this and whether or not it's successful could probably be an entire podcast episode in and of itself. So I'll kind of skip over that. But because it's a bit more experimental, it allows us as teaching assistants to also be more experimental in our seminars. And one of the things that myself and Jenny Riley, who's a PhD student at Durham University as well, have decided to do was to do photo elicitation, but as a teaching useful tool rather than as an anthropological interviewing tool. So one of the ideal types that Douglas has set out was a natural worldview. So I asked students to take a picture of what they think embodies a natural worldview. And then we sat around and we chatted about all of the pictures that we had in a variety of formats, asking them very solid questions like, which picture makes you feel uncomfortable? And then we'd sit around and talk about why they had picked the picture that they had. And it ended up revealing a lot more about how people saw the world differently from one another, which is always very difficult to get to, especially at Durham, where most of our undergraduate students are all from a very similar socioeconomic, racial, and geographical background. So to be able to pull out their inner thoughts through the images actually was incredibly useful.
Excellent.
Yeah. I've had a really good experiment with our first year students in intro week, just as they're just coming in and being inducted. I had them take a photograph of what they think is the heart of the university, to represent it with, taking a photo on their mobile phone, and then to send me the photo, and then we can look at the different images. And I got really nice spread from quite obvious choices like the chapel or the bar or the coffee place, but also some more sort of creative ones, like there was an image that they took of themselves to show that the students were the heart of the university. And those are the ones that came to mind. But so I'm interested in getting students to produce media, and hopefully in the future to actually make more sort of media. We've already had them doing little documentaries or podcasts, or digital things, but maybe to even make a kind of something more like interactive documentary filmmaking in the future, which is what our university specializes in.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scope now that everyone's got a sort of portable, well, now that most people, I should say, at a typical UK university will have a sort of portable media studio in their pocket of producing video content and audio content. Just one thing to throw in there, I've always had these great intentions of doing a lot of innovative things that never quite had time. But what I've started to try and do, I was getting a bit fed up constantly typing up comments on students' essays, and I noticed that in our sort of marking suite, it gave the option to record audio, and I thought that this might, because you can get a lot more over in the tone of your voice, that the nuance might not come through in text. So I've started to try where I can to offer audio comments on essays, and I've also offered audio feedback on like dissertation submissions and things like that. It's just, I think it's a way you can really emphasize what's actually important, and they can also tell from the tone of your voice, if you actually do like something, and you can be a lot more reassuring where things can come across maybe quite harsh in text form. So that's a way, I guess, I'm trying to incorporate more innovative things into teaching, but it's on the assessment side. And how about you, Tim?
Well, from my point of view, having been in this field of research now for 10 or 15 years, I've gone through quite a journey of trying to persuade universities that what I do is a really significant thing that is worth having in their department. Because to start with, people would say, well, digital seems a bit niche. So I try and present media as our lens onto studying what really matters, whatever that might be. Or perhaps considering media, as we've been discussing before, as a way of thinking about religion itself and how religious worldviews and experiences and practices really work. And what's actually taken me a bit by surprise over the last year or so is to realize that actually the research I've been doing, as I slightly pejoratively introduced it way back at the beginning of this podcast, is basically about big, clumsy, traditional institutions struggling to adapt and catch up to a media world that they don't quite understand, but they're pretty sure that the young people are really into nowadays. That's basically the story of what I've been doing for my whole career. And suddenly I've discovered, joining a university department, that's the institution I've joined. That's exactly what they're doing. The same conversations that I used to study from the Pope writing in 2002. I've now got the Vice Chancellor of my university saying in 2018, almost word for word repeating the same arguments. And the digital has gone from being a niche topic that a few people study to an imposed agenda for our teaching programs. It is necessary to ensure that students are learning digital skills for the workplace as well as traditional humanities, essay writing, and examination skills. And so very suddenly I found that I'm required to attend 105 different committees and think tanks and organizations, all of which will plaintively say, well, we feel like we should be doing something digital. And that's going to be a rapidly changing environment, which is very interesting to watch. But starting to have university or university-wide conversations that are ongoing about how we ensure that every lecture is recorded, and how we then ensure that anybody watches the videos. And do we then have any data to suggest that watching videos of lectures actually helps students learn? And how do we replace essays with new forms of assessment that might teach some digital skills? And in that case, is there any way we could actually teach some digital skills to the teachers, which is a bit of a problem that is emerging, I think. It's very easy to say all students need to do a video assignment, but apart from Suzanne, who has a huge advantage from her colleagues at Leeds Trinity, those of us in kind of traditional theology and religious studies departments probably don't have a colleague who does a lot of video. So there is a hope that sometimes comes up in some of these meetings that, of course, our students nowadays will have all of these digital skills. So maybe the students could teach some of those digital skills to the lecturers in order to have them taught back again for assessment. So there's not exactly a solution to that at the moment that I see. It's also a program that, by its nature, seems to be essentially evolving. Once you've decided that your institution will invest heavily in technology, you then need to upgrade all of the technology next year forever. And once you have taught everybody how to use one system, you need to then give them a refresher course on the next system. But in my own teaching, I'm introducing a new assignment that will require students to produce videos or podcasts and reflect on that experience. But there are a lot of technical challenges to doing that. It turns out when everybody in your class has their own video making device, but none of those devices are compatible with the other devices, you can actually spend weeks trying to work out how you actually upload all of those things into the university system so that they can be stored properly and assessed through an online marking system that was not set up to do any of this. There are probably not enough technical support people in the university for every class to have somebody who is full-time just reminding the students which cables they need to use to plug their phones into things. So there are challenges, but it's interesting to see. It's nice to study disasters sometimes, as I said at the start of this. Those can be very informative.
Yeah, I often find that by the time academics are paying attention to something, it's already out of fashion. Right, we've talked on a lot longer than I intended, but it's been an excellent discussion. But we're going to have to wrap it up for the sake of our poor listeners, our poor transcriber. But thank you all so much for joining me on the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.
It's such a great delight to hear the continuing conversation about media and the study of religion. As a podcast, Chris, one of the things that we really have is this opportunity both to participate in the theory of the discussion as well as the kind of creation of some of the new landscape for media and the study of religion. What are some of your thoughts about having been involved with podcasting and using that kind of media to study religion for so long now?
Well, I think I was planning to mention that in the podcast itself, but I don't think we got round to it. It was a couple of months ago. Yeah, I mean, podcasting certainly for me is a excellent medium. It's your own sort of personal curated radio station. You know, you just get to spend your time listening to programs that you're interested in, and I hope that we've made our way into some of our listeners' sort of regular listening habits. We've struggled a bit on the RSP, I think, to get beyond the sit a scholar down, talk about their most recent book, send them on their way kind of sort of back and forth conversation. But I think that format is appreciated. And I think that one of the key things about podcasting in religious studies for me has been the way it allows access points into research that busy researchers may not have time to read, and that interested students and members of the public might be trying out what is religious studies all about, or what is this specific topic, and it allows a more free-form approach, a more conversational approach, which I think is quite important to democratizing knowledge. And it provides a free output, in a sense. If a scholar's worked on an article or a book and we come along for a conversation, they get to put it into their own words in a conversational style, which means that the publication's getting cited and might get people directed to it, but it's also a very easy way to take your research and translate it and sort of republish it in a different format that can often be much more accessible than perhaps some of the denser writing styles that we have. So how about yourself after your sort of 4 months at the helm of the RSP and with your other experiences?
One of the things that I've been really surprised in, and as I was preparing to kind of, enter into that transition, I was doing a lot of research about what the landscape of religious studies podcasting looked like in late 2019. And there were a number of new podcasts that were either about to launch or were launching at the same time as Brienne and I were stepping into the managing editor role. So there were podcasts about contemporary kind of evangelical political stuff. And so my interview with Brad Onishi about straight white American Jesus. But there's also new podcasts from the Sikh professor, Simranjit Singh, who is doing a much more kind of social justice and maybe more politically oriented, in the sense of speaking with political leaders and real figures out there in the country and in Canada as well, who are making a huge impact through their actions and their employment and their businesses. And then just this past week, there was a new podcast launched called Religion 101 by Megan Godwin, and they are doing so many interesting things now that I think it's still a really lively, thriving space where there is room for conversation. The New Books in Religion and the New Book Network has so many wonderful opportunities for people to kind of really discuss at length their larger projects, but for smaller projects, for themes, for specific topics that might be discussed in undergraduate classrooms, we still are kind of, I think there's still a lot of room there for us, and I'm hoping that the RSP can continue to kind of find that niche of conversation tied to research and tied to scholarship and tied to the big issues and ideas that challenge our field. And so I'm so pleased to be involved with it. And the work that the RSP has done with media is so important for that, I think, because it really expresses that kind of metacritical analysis, that we're self-aware that we are both engaging in the object that we're talking about, media, and also trying to understand what its influence might be on religion and religious studies. And so I think there's that back and forth that's really valuable. And so I'm so pleased to kind of be involved in what seems like such a thriving area of scholarly production right now.
Excellent. Yeah, and just before we wrap up, I don't know if I'll be letting the cat out of the bag here, but listeners should be aware that at the moment our Patreon subscribers and some other member organizations have access to some additional content that we've been producing. Our Are You My Data episodes, which are sort of more conversational and maybe slightly irreverent in engagements with big hitters in the field, but also our discourse episodes, which we've been putting out every month, which are taking a sort of critical religious studies look at contemporary news stories and their intersections with this problematic category of religion. And we've been thinking that actually this is one of the things that it seems to be really missing in the existing podcasting output, certainly, but also in many other forms. Scholars offering hyper-relevant recent comment from an RS perspective, and we've, I think, as a body, decided that we'd quite like to start putting that content out to everyone publicly, because it's become a solid, good format, and it is really demonstrating sort of RS being done and being relevant. So hopefully that'll be another string to our bow, as it were, that people can look forward to soon. Of course, you should still subscribe on Patreon.
Yeah, absolutely. We're hoping to really kind of create a third avenue maybe for our patrons to really develop their chops, not only supporting the work that we do, but also engaging in some of those conversations as well. And so we hope that the Patreon support continues, but we're hoping to try to find ways to really make those discussions and conversations that we're having with scholars a little bit more accessible and a little bit more available to the wider public as well.
Indeed.
Next week, we have a really exciting interview on this issue, in fact. Do you want to say what we've got going on next week? Yeah. Since I think I know a bit too much about the interview that happened.
Yeah, well, we have an unknown voice on the RSP, a certain Dave McConaughey, has been speaking with Elise Morgenstern First about religious literacy is social justice. That's the title. So there's a lot going on there. A lot, I imagine, that some people might take issue with or might be sort of rabidly in support of. So I'm looking forward to that and to hearing what sort of reaction it gets. But I think, come back for that. We've actually got, I think, 3 responses. If they all come out, we've got 3 responses lined up for this week's podcast as well. So and do keep checking back on the social media feeds and on the website. But I think all that's left to say is our usual, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's him. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox, with marketing managed by Benjamin Marcus. Our Opportunities Digest managed by Ella Buck, podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, and social media managed by Ray Radford.
Don't forget, you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.